Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our exciting fellowship event with our Vanderbilt University Fellow, Toby, and Jerusalem Post journalist, Lahav Harkov. Before we get started and before we introduce Toby, I just wanted to set some housekeeping so everyone can participate to their fullest ability. So we are in webinar format, which means that you can participate and ask questions through our Q&A function. So throughout the webinar, even before Q&A starts, please feel free to submit questions there. And we'll make sure that Toby reads those questions off once it is time for Q&A. For those of you joining in on Facebook Live, please feel free to ask questions on there as well, and we'll make sure that we pass along those questions to Toby too. Now to introduce Toby and get our event started, Toby is a senior at Vanderbilt University studying child development, law, history, and society. Toby was born in Israel and raised in New York and is planning on attending law school in the fall. As an undergrad, Toby served as the president of First VU, a premier student-run organization which works to support and empower first-generation students at Vanderbilt. Outside of class, Toby volunteers her time with the Louis D. Brandeis Center for Human Rights and is also a CAMERA Fellow for CAMERA on Campus. Thanks so much for helping us plan this event, Toby. And without further ado, we'll pass it along to you so you can introduce Lahav and we can begin our event.
Thank you so much, David. Hi, everyone. My name is Toby, and I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you guys more about the current state of the Israeli political scene and how we can better understand how we got to where we are today. I'm excited to introduce Lahav, who's been really gracious with her time right now to speak with us a little bit more about this information. Lahav is the senior contributing editor of the Jerusalem Post, and she's just the Jerusalem Post's diplomatic correspondent, analyzing and reporting on Israel's relations with the world, the Prime Minister's office, the National Security Council, the Foreign Ministry, and more. Lahav was the Jerusalem Post's top analyst and reporter in the Knesset for over 8 years and was the Jerusalem Post's former news editor and the managing editor of jpost.com. Lahav is an expert on Israel's domestic and international politics, having interviewed major figures across the Israeli political spectrum, and she has the inside scoop on the country's top lawmakers and diplomats. With that being said, I'm going to pass the ball to Lahav to kind of walk us through a little bit more of what we should know and how we got to where we are today.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's evening by me from Tel Aviv. I'm really happy to be speaking to you about what is our fourth election in 2 years. It is an extremely complicated story of how we got here and who the different players are, and I will try to tell it to you as succinctly as possible, but as clearly as possible in half an hour before I take your questions. So here goes. I'll begin by explaining to you the way the Israeli electoral system works. Israel has a parliamentary system. When people show up to vote on election day, they go to their polling place. People get a little card in the mail that tells them where they can go to vote, and they're supposed to bring ID with them. And in Israel, that's not controversial. Everybody gets government ID. Everyone carries that. It's supposed to carry that ID with them all the time. So you show your ID, you come in, you get behind a screen, and then in front of you is a big tray with lots of compartments. In each compartment, there's a pile of little pieces of paper. Each little piece of paper has the name of a party. So you pick your paper out of the pile, the party you want to vote for, you put it in an envelope, and you drop it in a ballot box. And I always like to say Israel is the startup nation, but we're still voting on little slips of paper dropped into ballot boxes, although that is one of the better ways to prevent voter fraud. So at least there's that. So when you're behind that screen and you're looking for a party to vote for, there's generally more than 30 different options. But 30 different parties don't get into our parliament. Our parliament has 120 seats, and it would be, it's messy enough as it is, as I mentioned, 4 elections in 2 years. So it's messy enough as it is, even without us having 30 parties. And so on average, you tend to have between 10 and 12 parties, at least in recent years. And the way it's determined sort of which parties get in and which parties stay out is that there's a threshold. So only parties that get over 3.25% of the vote actually get into the Knesset. And then the 120 seats in the Knesset get divided up proportionately between those parties that got above 3.25% of the vote. But at that point, as you can imagine, if there are 120 seats and there are 10 to 12 parties in the Knesset, no one party has ever had a majority. And so the next step in the process is that you have to create a coalition. That process begins with the heads of the different parties coming to the president. Right now, our president is Reuven Rivlin. Now, the role of the president is generally ceremonial. He meets new ambassadors. He meets, other state leaders that come visit Israel, but he doesn't have such a practical role most of the time. The one time that he has a practical role, and it's a very, very important one, is after the election, because after the votes are counted, as I said, the party leaders come to the president and they tell the president who they recommend to be the next prime minister. The president then, listens to all the recommendations. He tallies up the amount of votes that stand behind different candidates for prime minister, and he's supposed to select the candidate with the most recommendations. Now, historically, usually the answer was clear. There was clearly one party that was a front runner, and then a lot of other parties, or at least enough other parties, would get behind that clear front runner, and it would be a majority of the Knesset recommending one person. In recent elections, it's been not as clear, and the numbers have been a lot closer, and I'll get into specifics of where we are now. But I just want you to understand sort of some of the places where things were tripped up on the way. At that point, the person who has the most recommendations, who is appointed by the president, has to start negotiating with the other parties to try to form a coalition. And the negotiations usually take place on two tracks. The first is sort of ideological. What kinds of policies do they want to promote as a coalition government? And the second are the jobs. What positions will the head of the party and other senior members of the parties get? And there's always a lot of drama about that specific sort of area of the negotiations. What if that candidate is able to get a majority of the members of Knesset to be in their coalition and agree to sort of the coalition agreement, then there's a new government sworn in and we get to sort of move forward as a country and have a functioning government. If that candidate can't form a government, then there's a second candidate, meaning the person with the second highest amount of recommendations to the president gets a shot at forming a coalition. So we've had this happen now twice. In Israel's history, it never happened before, but in the end, it happened in 2019 and in 2020. So the first time that we had a repeat 2 elections in a row, we ended up having 3 elections in a row, and now we're on the 4th election with a break of about a year. But the actual coalition that was formed only lasted about 8 months. There's a lot of history, sort of how we got there. But I'm going to sort of bring us forward to the election that we're on now, because not that much has changed. And so if I tell you some of the problems in this election, well, I should say certain things have really changed. It's almost like in the grand scheme of things, people are going to forget what changed in this little year and a half of history. But I'll tell you a little bit about where we are now, and it will sort of help you understand where Israel was before. So I'll start with Likud. Likud is the biggest party in Israel in terms of members of Knesset, in terms of members of the public who are party members. And the head of Likud, Prime Minister Netanyahu, has now been prime minister for 12 consecutive years, in addition to being prime minister for 3 years in the 90s. Israel doesn't have term limits because you don't vote for prime minister. As I said before, you vote for a party. And so, if the party keeps winning, and the party in its own internal process, which in the case of Likud, it actually has primaries. There's over 100,000 members of Likud paying members. It's a very small amount of money. It's like $7 basically. But every paying member of Likud has a right to vote in the election for the leader, and Netanyahu keeps winning. And then Likud keeps winning elections. So that's why he's been able to be prime minister for so long. There are many reasons, but that's part of the story. So Likud is the largest party, as I said. And in this election, they're the largest as well. And a little bit about sort of their positions. Likud is considered sort of a moderate right-wing party. Now, in Israel, when you talk about right or left, in many ways it tracks with other parts of the world on economic issues, on social issues. But what Israelis generally emphasize when they're talking about right and left is is their position on sort of the Palestinians and whether they want to make concessions or not towards a two-state solution. So the further you get to the right, the fewer concessions they'll want to make as far as land is concerned, and the less likely they are to agree to a two-state solution. And there are all sorts of alternatives, a popular one being Palestinian autonomy. The further to the left, the more it is for a two-state solution, and the more they think that Israel should concede, going all the way to sort of pre-1967 lines. So Likud is on the right, but the moderate right. Netanyahu says he doesn't support a two-state solution, but he also supported the Trump peace plan. He also had his own speech called the Bar-Ilan speech, where essentially a Palestinian state that would be a demilitarized Palestinian state, and Israel would still have major security presence on all of its borders. So people have called it a state minus. So it's sort of a two-state solution, but it would mean Israel not withdrawing from any of the Jewish communities or the Israeli communities in Judea and Samaria. So it would be without any settlements being destroyed. And so this makes the Palestinian state sort of difficult, not contiguous, but that's an entire hour-long lecture separate from the politics. Now, the big political issue that Likud is standing for right now is their big thing that they're campaigning on right now is Netanyahu's handling of the coronavirus pandemic. So, I just gave you a whole spiel on the two-state solution, the Palestinians, but in reality, Israel is talking about the Palestinians are not a function at all of this election. And usually security is at the top of people's lists in elections, and it's barely come up this time because, like everyone else in the world, we're dealing with a pandemic. Netanyahu is campaigning really hard on the fact that Israel is the first country to have the vast majority of its adults vaccinated. There's already 60% of the, let's see if I get the numbers right. I believe 60% of all adults have gotten 2 doses, and there's an even greater percentage that have gotten 1 dose. And if you're someone who already recovered from COVID, then you only need 1 dose. So it's basically, we had a very, very successful vaccine drive, and Netanyahu personally played a big role in it. As the CEO of Pfizer admitted on the news last week, Netanyahu called him 30 times to convince him to have Israel be the test case, that Pfizer would sort of flood Israel with vaccines so that people can look at Israel and how the vaccine works at helping a population get out of lockdowns, in this endless cycle of COVID. And we are getting out of our lockdowns. Last week, almost everything opened up again. I went to the gym for the first time this morning. That was exciting for me because I've been vaccinated twice as well. And and the numbers of people getting sick is really dropping. That's, it's not rising exponentially anymore. So it's Netanyahu can point to that and say, my policies, my connections, my stature on the international stage are really what's helping us. Now, of course, up until we got the vaccines, things were very chaotic here. We had 3 different lockdowns. Compared to most of the developed world, Israeli children had very few days in school. So, there are places that Netanyahu's critics can really point out problems. But in any case, Netanyahu is very focused on the issue of the vaccines and also now on economic recovery, now that a lot of the businesses can reopen again. But in the end, it sort of comes down to a referendum on Netanyahu. Netanyahu himself is a very polarizing figure. People love him or hate him. And this election, like the 3 before it, in many ways boils down to yes, Bibi, no Bibi. So let me tell you about some of the people who say yes, Bibi. Netanyahu's sort of perennial coalition partners are the ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and United Torah Judaism. Excuse me a second. There are two different ultra-Orthodox parties. They're divided between Ashkenazi Jews of European descent and Sephardic Jews who are of North African and Middle Eastern descent. They've decided on this division themselves. They have sort of different religious customs and different rabbis, and that's how they divide their parties. Their issues, they really want to maintain the religious status quo in Israel. The official government-provided religious services in Israel are Orthodox and a very strict brand of Orthodoxy. They want to maintain the exemption for ultra-Orthodox students to not have to go to the military when they're 18 years old, among other sort of very sectoral issues. But Netanyahu is very popular in that sector of society. And so they are very strong supporters of Netanyahu. Once upon a time, the ultra-Orthodox could have sat in any government, left or right. That was when religion and state issues were sort of less controversial in Israel. And that was before there was talk about the left being willing to divide up Jerusalem with the Palestinians. And so over the years, the ultra-Orthodox have stuck with the right, and especially Netanyahu at this point. The other party that has promised that they would only sit with Netanyahu is called the Religious Zionist Party. They are not the only party representing religious Zionists, but they've named themselves that. Religious Zionists is not exactly, but it's somewhat comparable to modern Orthodox Jews in the US. But this party in particular is the far right in Israel. And it's a bloc made up of sort of three different smaller parties that include some very extremist groups. Extremists both on issues pertaining to Arabs and Palestinians. They're anti in general, and also one of the parties making up this small bloc is explicitly a homophobic party. So they're sort of a very extreme right-wing group, and it looks like Netanyahu is going to have to rely on them in order to get a majority. So that will be, I think, a big deal moving forward. Then you have one party in the middle that is a maybe Bibi party, right? I said this election is sort of yes Bibi, no Bibi. So there's a party called Yamina. They're the other religious Zionist party. They're to Netanyahu's right when it comes to the Palestinian issues. They're also to Netanyahu's right when it comes to economic issues. Netanyahu is a big free market capitalist, but they're sort of even more so, and they think that Netanyahu doesn't go far enough. And the party's leader, Naftali Bennett, he also has his own sort of like alternative plan of how the government should deal with COVID. And so many people who are right-wing but felt that the government was not handling the pandemic well were flocking to him. And when the election was called, he was doing very, very well in the polls. But now that Israel's recovering pretty well, he can't his main sort of campaigning shtick. So, there was a little bit of a struggle there. But anyway, Bennett has not committed to recommending Netanyahu in the past. He, as a party leader, always recommended Netanyahu, but now he thinks that Netanyahu's time is up, that he did not do well handling the pandemic. Netanyahu also, can't believe I forgot to mention this, has several corruption cases ongoing against him. Now, Israeli law allows him to continue to be prime minister unless he's convicted after appeal. So, as far as the law is concerned, he can address values and how people feel about that, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as the law. And so on that front, there's a party called New Hope, which was a breakaway party from Likud, founded by Gideon Sa'ar, a former senior minister in Likud, formerly one of the most popular members of Likud, who would do very well in Likud primaries. But he broke off from Likud. He felt that Netanyahu was corrupt, that he's sort of trying to do everything for his own sort of to save himself from being convicted. But beyond that, you could like see the different, you put both parties under a microscope and you could barely tell what's different about them, whether it's economically, whether it's on security issues, they're very, very similar parties. But New Hope, which if you're all thinking about Star Wars jokes, I did that too. But in any case, New Hope is, they have promised not to recommend Netanyahu. So they're sort of the party for people who are right-wing and really don't like Netanyahu. Now, it sounds like there are a lot of right-wing parties in the Knesset, you are absolutely right. The parties that I've now are make up a clear majority of the Knesset, more than 70 seats. And remember, you only need 61 for a majority. And there's another party that's pretty right-wing called Yisrael Beitenu, led by Dor Lieberman. They are a party that mostly has support from Russian-speaking immigrants. There are about a million Israelis who are from the former Soviet Union, including Lieberman, who's the leader of that party. Their big focus, aside from promising that they will not support Netanyahu and be a government with Netanyahu, is that they're very secularist and they're anti the ultra-Orthodox. They're anti the ultra-Orthodox hold on the religious services in the country. They want more secularization. Now we're getting into the not the right, the center and the left. So the biggest party in the not BB bloc is called Yesh Atid, and it's led by Yair Lapid, and it's a centrist party. Yair Lapid was a famous television personality before he came into politics. He was a talk show host, he was a news anchor, he wrote a weekly newspaper column, and he's really one of the biggest celebrities in Israel. But he also came from a political family. His father had been justice minister, and he came into politics wanting to change. He felt that too much government money goes to special interest groups. He also is for secularizing. And so he's very focused on domestic issues, really. He doesn't have a big record on security or on foreign affairs, even though he speaks English well and is a good sort of presenter for Israel. I think he's given some nice speeches whenever abroad, but overall his strengths are on domestic issues, which in theory would help now that everyone sort of looked inward and is talking about COVID and economic recovery. But he is in second place after Netanyahu. His party is in second place after Netanyahu, but trailing about 10 seats behind. Likud is at 28 to 30 seats in the polls, and they're at 18, Yesh Atid is at 18, 19 in the polls. But if there's someone who's prime minister who's not Netanyahu, because of the numbers, it's most likely Lapid. Then you have two parties on the left. You have the Labor Party and you have Meretz, which even though Labor led the country for the first 29 years after Israel's establishment, they're now a party that only has about a handful of votes. And the same with Meretz, which for a long time was sort of the far left party. At the moment, they're barely distinguishable from each other on social issues, on security issues, on economic issues. They're both sort of social democrat, almost socialist. They both sort of hold the sort of social values of the left on racism issues, on LGBT issues, on, climate change issues, climate change is huge all over the Western world, and it's like barely anything in Israel, which is, climate affects everyone. I think that's a problem. That's barely anything in Israel, but that is the case. But on the left, they do talk about it more. Then after that, we have Arab parties. Now, it's important for me to clarify that nobody is forcing Arabs to run in separate parties. And there are Arab candidates in a lot of other parties, in Meretz, in Labor, in Likud. A lot of these candidates, Arab candidates, do run in other parties. However, Israeli Arabs do tend to vote for sectoral parties, the way ultra-Orthodox tend to vote for ultra-Orthodox parties. Right now, there are two running. There's one called the Joint List, which is a block of 3 different parties, and there's one called Ra'am, which is from the Islamic movement. Now, the Joint List and Ra'am all used to run together. There's fascinating process going on in Israeli Arab politics that I could give a lecture on that alone. But basically, the leader of Ra'am, his name is Mansour Abbas, he was sick of the situation where the Israeli Arab parties are sort of spectators. They're in the Knesset, but they never join a coalition, and they don't really cooperate with the ruling government ever, or only on very, very minor ways. Mansour Abbas, they wanted to be a bigger player on the Israeli field because they felt that that will help their constituents have a better life, have better infrastructure, have better education, funding for their schools, all the things that you can get from government that, a minority group, if they have good representation, can fight for them better. But the Joint List, which is larger, they're predicted to get about 8 seats in the next Knesset, while Ra'am is predicted to get 4. But the Joint List takes a more ideological stance that they view Israel as occupiers of Palestine, quote unquote, and they don't want such close cooperation with the Zionists. So there's a very interesting sort of political process happening in Israeli Arab society. And it really picked up speed after the second election of this 4-election cycle, when the sort of anti-Bibi bloc, which was led by a party called Blue and White, which included Yesh Atid at the time. This is unnecessarily complicated. The anti-Bibi bloc wanted the joint lists votes to help them form a government that was Netanyahu. And it sort of sparked a lot of Israeli Arabs like imagination to think that, oh, we can really be important here. We can really not just be a part of the game because democracy allows us to vote people in the Knesset, but our representatives can really have an influence. And clearly a lot of people like that because looks like it'll get into the Knesset. So those are basically all the parties that are expected to get into the Knesset. Now, looking forward, I didn't give exact numbers for all the parties, but it is hard for me to promise that we won't have a 5th election. If we don't have a 5th election, it will come from people being willing to break their promises, basically, in order to avoid a 5th election. Now, breaking promises sounds bad, but maybe it's not so bad when you make stupid promises. So, you know, when the country is in this spiral of political chaos, maybe sometimes you shouldn't be parties shouldn't be boycotting one another, which is the situation right now. It's like a logic puzzle. This with this, and this person won't sit with this, and this person will only sit with this. How can you reach 61? So right now, Netanyahu's Likud party, right, the people who promise to sit with him are the ultra-Orthodox parties and the religious Zionist parties, and then there's the maybe of Yamina. And in most of the recent polls, all of them put together only reach 59 or 60, and that's not a majority. But then you say, oh, but then without, you know, the other side of the map is a majority. The problem is, as I said, the joint list, which would probably have 8 or 9 seats, is not going to join any coalition. And even though Ra'am, the other Arab party, wants to be a bigger player, I would categorize them together with Meretz, the far left party, where their positions are at an extreme that's very different from even the mainstream right, that it might be hard to reconcile and have them all sit in one coalition. So it's hard to see, if the polls are accurate, it's hard to see how we could avoid a 5th election. And I really hate to say it because I'm usually an optimist, but the situation is not great. Now, Likud, and I just spoke to Likud's campaign manager today, they believe from their internal polling that they will do much better and that Netanyahu will get a majority, he will sweep the nation again and will be reelected yet again. So maybe not, we don't know. But that's more or less what is happening in the political game right now. I just spoke my half hour, so I would love to answer some of your questions. Let's see in the chat box. Do we have questions here? I have one. Nope. Feel free to submit questions in the Q&A function. So that means I'm looking in the wrong place. I don't see the Q&A. Yeah.
Hi. So we have them on this side here. I'm going to read something from Ariel Fagan. This question just came in a few seconds ago. And then afterwards, I have a question or two of my own. But Ariel wants to know, why in the past few years has Netanyahu been labeled as an extremist? His name in left-wing circles and publications has been almost as bad as people like Trump or Putin. This is especially surprising considering he's quite moderate. He's been quite moderate throughout his career and quite often knocked within Likud for going too easy on the Arabs and giving too much up in negotiation compared to old school Likudnik. So I think the question is explaining Netanyahu's personification and characterization in the media.
Yeah, I think there are a few issues. First of all, there's this assumption that a lot of people abroad make that if Netanyahu is not prime minister anymore, that things are going to be very different, and that Netanyahu is the reason that Israel does things they don't like. And that assumption, you know, maybe there are some specific things they don't like that are Netanyahu, but overall, The majority of Israelis are right-wing, and if you look at the polls, it looks like the next Knesset will have 80 out of 120 sort of right-wing seats. That means people who are not going to easily just give up a bunch of land and say, we'll have a Palestinian state next week, which is at least theoretically these people's criticism. In practice, some of them don't think there should be any Israel, as opposed to, just Israel giving some land, but assuming good faith on their part. So, Netanyahu is not really unique in this way. Israelis have been through difficult experiences, first with the Oslo Accords, where Israel has really made very big compromises and sort of recognized the Palestinians and allowed them to have their own kind of autonomy in the form of the Palestinian Authority. And immediately after, the Palestinians started bombing buses throughout Israel. In 2000, Ehud Barak offered the Palestinians 97% of Judea and Samaria, and offered to divide Jerusalem, and the Palestinians rejected it. And then the second Intifada, the huge wave of terrorism that lasted for about 5 years, started after that. So Israelis are, and then in 2005, Israel withdrew from Gaza fully. There's no Israeli presence inside Gaza and hasn't been since 2005, except for, a few military operations. And the result of that was a year later, Hamas won the elections in Gaza, and they started shooting rockets at Israeli civilian centers. So overall, Israelis are very skeptical about making concessions to the Palestinians, and it's not about Netanyahu. I would say there are two other factors here. When it comes to Iran, Netanyahu is very determined not to let Iran get a nuclear weapon, and he doesn't trust Iran. He doesn't trust the mullahs, which I think in the past 5 years he's been proven that they're not trustworthy. But in any case, he went head-to-head with President Obama, who is sort of the darling of the left, and he's done good things and he's done bad things. I'm not expressing even an opinion about President Obama, but specifically when it comes to Iran, Netanyahu went head-to-head with him. And so I think, a lot of Americans on the left saw him as problematic. And I've heard from people, including in the Congressional Black Caucus, who think that Netanyahu is racist for going against Obama, when, genuinely, the issue is Iran. It does not have to do with the color of Obama's skin. But that is how some people took that. The third thing is that Israel is a nation state. Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish people. And in a lot of countries in the West, including in the US, the concept of nationalism has become a dirty word. Now, a lot of countries were built over that idea of the concept of a specific nation having its own state. That's not how the US was built necessarily, but that is how Israel was built. People talk about Netanyahu as being a nationalist leader. I don't know of any Israeli who's not, because we are a nation state. But, these are all things that sort of add up to certain elements of the left really, viewing Netanyahu as some kind of extremist, when you're correct to say that in the Israeli context, he's not.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that thoughtful and authentic response. I think it's a little bit hard to talk about the media's characterization of all of these things, particularly given the intersection between the media and the democratic process. We have a further question that wants to know whether you think that political polarization is helped or hurt by the multi-party system compared to the first past the post system we have in the US.
I think that there are pros and cons. I think right now, when we're on election number 4, right, with only a very brief period of an actual government, you can see what the cons are, that there is no clear winner. Overall, over the decades, I thought it was a good thing that having a parliamentary system forces sort of very different groups in society to have to work together in partnership in order to run the country. But right now, we are experiencing a blip. So we're experiencing some big problems, and I hope that we'll get past them. I think that there's a middle ground. I think that perhaps raising the electoral threshold so that there aren't as many small parties could help. Although the threshold is now higher than it was 10 years ago, and we didn't have this problem 10 years ago, and we do have it now.
Awesome. And then Jacob Feldstein wants to know, if it was anyone else but Netanyahu as the face of the Likud party, would Israel still be in this scenario? Does he himself turn away potential Likud voters?
Yeah, I don't think the issue is turning away Likud voters necessarily, but I mean, he does turn away some Likud voters, right? But you have to think that if Gidon Saar was the head of Likud, right, there are enough people, and I think there are a lot of people who are sort of enchanted with Netanyahu specifically, so he would turn off voters as well. I think the real issue is that Netanyahu he's become a more and more polarizing figure over the years. And I think that the big thing in recent years is, of course, that he is, first he was under investigation for corruption accusations, and now he's indicted, and now his trial has already started. And these are things that, people truly believe that you should not have a sitting prime minister who's on trial for corruption, that, Netanyahu should step down. And if he gets off, if he's exonerated, then he can run for politics again. And I think that if that were not the case, then Netanyahu would have an easier time forming a coalition and building a government.
And then how do
the way I just said it made it sound like I'm blaming the other people. I'm not blaming them. I think that that's a legitimate, I think both stances are legitimate, to be honest. I think it's legitimate to say you don't want a prime minister on trial. And I also think it's legitimate for Netanyahu to say, I'm going to fight for my innocence and the law lets me stay prime minister, right? I think that those are both reasonable stances, but they are part of what's keeping us from forming a government.
And then how do the protests that are currently the manifestations of those things influence the elections then?
So for a few years now, there have been regular protests outside Netanyahu's house in Jerusalem. Sometimes there are bigger protests in like bigger town squares around Israel against Netanyahu and saying that he should resign because of the corruption. I don't think they've had any sort of discernible impact on the elections, to be honest, especially this election. The protests were really, really big sort of around the time of the last couple of elections. And they continue to be really big during the COVID lockdowns. It was one of the only things that you could leave lockdown to do, because the Attorney General said that it's sort of suppressing freedom of expression and, democratic politics to stop protests. So there were a lot of protests, a lot of people not keeping social distance for the sake of politics. But at this point, they're really small. There's really not a lot of people going anymore. And I'm not really sure that they changed anything. The number of people who are sort of voting for the parties that I feel like those protests represented to some extent is much smaller than the other side.
Interesting. Okay, that's helpful to understand kind of the context of the extent that the protests have an effect or don't on the actual political stage there. Because I think there's kind of like a wave of protests happening both in Israel and in the States. And it's interesting to see the differences and impact that has and whether or not that relates to the concept of the multi-party system versus the first past.
Yeah. I mean, when I look at the protests that were happening in the US and the protests that are happening in Israel, is in the US, the huge wave of protests, I'm not talking about the Capitol riots, I'm talking about like the Black Lives Matter protests, right? Like that, it's true that they're associated with the left, but overall they were about an issue, right? They were about a problem in America. And the Netanyahu protests are about a specific person, a specific politician. So I think that narrow appeal, right? Because I mean, in the US, you only have two political parties anyway, but I just think that there's something very different there. It's interesting to hear them compared because it's not something that I would have thought of. I don't know, is that something you're seeing like in the media or we're seeing in the media?
It was just funny for me because my Instagram stories, I have friends in Israel and friends in the US, and over the summer I would go through them and there would be protests for Netanyahu and then protests for Black Lives Matter. And it was like back to back just on my Instagram stories as I was scrolling. So the comparison wasn't necessarily exactly there, but in my mind, I was kind of thinking about the differences and kind of what that political representation and demonstrations were looking like.
That's interesting. Yeah. About 10 years ago, it was 10 years ago, you had the protests that turned into the Arab Spring, and they started in January of 2011. And then about 6 months later in Israel, you started a mass protest movement that was about economic issues, and people were pitching tents and sleeping in parks in Israel. And about 3 months after that, Occupy Wall Street started. And so that was also this situation where everyone was protesting everywhere. But the Israeli protests and Occupy Wall Street were kind of similar. I think Occupy Wall Street was sort of radical in a way, like in the politics, whereas in Israel it actually reflected, I think, a very strong movement sort of in the center, in the mainstream of Israel, that wanted to sort of lower the cost of living here. But that, for example, was a time when I felt like the politics were sort of very connected both here and there. But summer of 2020, not so much.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to see how those election campaigning continues to happen. So a lot of the 2020 summer and kind of up until November was a lot in the US talking about elections and campaigning and electioning.
Right.
In Israel, that conversation kind of never ends. We have an interesting question here from Molly. She wants to know what you see as the future of the left wing in Israel, given the shrinking numbers in McPhus.
So the left wing does have a problem. They're shrinking all the time. I think that, first of all, like Labor and Meretz, they need to just like bite the bullet and merge. Because I just don't think that they're both in danger of dropping below the threshold. And probably, if I had to guess, what would end up happening is one will pass and the other won't. And at this point, it looks like it's more likely to be Labor, but you don't know for sure. And if they want to have a viable left-wing party to continue to exist in Israel, they need to work together and not against each other. The other thing I would say is that Lapid and Yesh Atid, they call themselves centrists, and they are centrists on some things, but I don't think there's such a big difference between them and where the Labor Party was just a few years ago. Right now, the head of the Labor Party is someone who would feel comfortable in Meretz. There's very little difference between them. But between 2015 and 2019, Labor was led by people who were on the left, but on the more moderate left. Bless you. So the people who call themselves left is a very small group. But I think that Yesh Atid is, a left. Especially at this point, because for a while they sort of made sure to have a mix of people who came from more right-wing backgrounds, more left-wing backgrounds, and now they don't as much.
Interesting. So definitely moving towards combining those groups and moving the Yesh Atid more towards the accepting that left-wing labeling.
Yeah, or, they don't have to. I mean, it's their marketing, it's their pain, but like the reality is that they are crack with the moderate left of Israel in recent decades.
Interesting. And then I had a question that's a little bit like taking a big step back here. I know a lot of times you kind of alluded to the idea of Zionism turning into a dirty word on campuses and taking away kind of the similarities between the concept of Zionism and the creation of nation states worldwide. And I think a lot of times when people are talking about the benefits of Zionism, one of the first reactions or responses, it's the only democratic state in the Middle East. It's the only place where democracy is being practiced. And I think the practice of democracy in and of itself is a really important thing to discuss in terms of the upholding of a nation state more generally. Can you talk a bit about what having 4 elections means for this kind of understanding of the democratization of the state and how you push back against elections that kind of call this type of democracy ineffective, or they don't accept the idea of Israel as the only democratic Middle East because of the kind of extent of these convoluted politics that we have to continue to wade through? What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I would say, first of all, that it's a bit hypocritical. I mean, like, nobody says like Belgium or Italy are not democracies, and like Belgium didn't have a government for like 2 years straight. Italy went through a phase where they had an election every other year, and Italy is a nation state, I think, these are, we're having a very difficult couple of years here in Israel politically. But America's had a difficult bunch of years politically as well, I would say. And I don't think that it makes these countries not democratic. It just means that, they're going through a rough time. I mean, I would say there are more difficult arguments that people make against Israel than that, right? The difficult argument really is about the Palestinians, to which I would say they have autonomy and they control basically their entire civil lives, right? They have their own health system. They have their own, well, maybe don't talk about that during COVID because people love to criticize that, but they do have their own health system, and they have their own education system, and they have their own courts. They have their own elections theoretically. When they decide not to hold the elections, it's their own decision and not Israel's. And so that's the criticism that's generally sort of harder to respond to in theory. Whereas in practice, Israel allows the Palestinians to run their own everyday lives. But as far as the democratic system in Israel, it's a strong democracy. Israel has its judiciary is sort of respected around the world. So it's an argument that I think is pretty weak. You would say that to people, I think.
I definitely agree that it's a weak argument. And I just think it's interesting to kind of hear and address it head on, because the answer is in the question itself. You can't critique a democracy when the democracy is working, when the democracy is consistently engaging with it, and the people are consistently voting and trying to create this reality.
Yeah,
so,
sometimes I joke like we have too much democracy.
So. Exactly. So I think that critique is one that I was just wanting to bring to the surface. We have another question here from our Facebook Live that's happening, and they want to know how the election is shaping up for Avigdor Lieberman and the Israel Beitenu party. They say they know that in previous elections he was viewed as a kingmaker, but with the rise of the New Hope, is this still the case, or has he faded?
Yeah, so I think Lieberman, I mentioned him a little bit earlier, it looks like he's going to get about 6 seats. He seems pretty solid with his 6 seats. He just has his core base, and he's not doing the job sort of breaking beyond that. He really was only the kingmaker in the first election, I would say. In the first election, he didn't commit to recommending Netanyahu or Benny Gantz, who was a candidate, the major candidate at the time against Netanyahu. And in the end, he didn't recommend anyone, actually. The next 2 elections, he really wasn't in as much of a position to be a kingmaker. At that point, he just said that he will not recommend Netanyahu, and he still says he will not recommend Netanyahu. So he's not really a kingmaker because he's not someone who can go one way or the other, right? And right now, it's Naftali Bennett who's probably more of a kingmaker. And also because I think Lieberman thought that by betting on not recommending Netanyahu, he would sort of draw in more voters. But in the end, it hasn't worked out for him because there are enough other parties that people can choose from.
Right, and I hope whoever's watching on Facebook that answered your question. Thank you for the clarification on that, Lahav. I have another question that I'm just not sure of factually. When is, or on what timeline is the Bibi kind of trial and arraignment and all of those kinds of things? When are we going to have more concrete information on the next steps there?
The next trial date, there was already like one date where they sort of read the charges, and the next date is on April 5th. But it could take like a couple of years. I mean, there's 3 different cases. They're big cases. There are a lot of witnesses. So I wouldn't expect it to end anytime soon.
Awesome. I don't think there's any more open questions in the Q&A or the chat. I don't see anything in Facebook either. I'd like to extend the opportunity to everybody who's watching right now, once again, to ask a question anywhere. We have about 10 minutes left to have access to Lahav's incredible information and knowledge. Okay, one more question coming up. Is there anything else you think we should be asking? Anything that's particularly interesting in the coming weeks or so that we should be on the lookout for?
Wow, I mean, the results of the election are what we would all like to know, right? What'll be interesting in this election is that usually within a couple of days, you have an idea of what the results are. The results are usually like certified after 5 days, but usually after a day or 2. And this time it could take as long as 2 weeks. The election is right before Pesach. Because of COVID, there are like sort of special polling places for people who are supposed to be in quarantine. So the estimate now is between it taking longer because of the sort of quarantine ballots and because they're going to stop counting during Passover for a few days, that it'll take 2 weeks for us to really know what the Knesset will look like. And that's going to be really crazy, I think. But there's another question that came up, right? You want to read it?
We have two more questions here. One is, what is a common misconception that international observers and people have about Israel's democracy and elections?
I don't know about a specific misconception, but I think that, well, there's a big misconception that people have in the US in general, that people think that race issues in the US apply to other countries. They apply pretty well to England, I'd say, but just about every other country in the world is culturally different, historically different. And to me, it's like when people are like, Israel's a white supremacist country, and like you just show them a picture of an Ethiopian Israeli soldier, and then like Aed Tamimi, if you guys know who Aed Tamimi is, there's this teenage girl who was assaulting soldiers. She has blonde hair and blue eyes and is about as white as I, like pale as I am. And you know, people think that the American framework and the American sort of view of things can just be plopped onto any other world problem, and it's just not the way things work in Israel. And I mean, you're asking, I think, more about the electoral system, but I think that in general, people take their own politics and try to think how it can apply to Israel, and that's a very human, because you want to use something that you understand to understand other things. But people need to know that things are very different from Israel. The issues that people care about the most are different. The sort of politics between different sectors of society are very different. They are much less about skin color than they are about things like religious observance, whether people come from, well, this is similar to America in some ways, but people haven't been talking about it as much in recent years, sort of rural versus urban. I think that's a big thing in Israel as well. Not rural, because there isn't that much rural land in Israel, but you know, people who live sort of in the Tel Aviv center of the country, as opposed to people who live in the Galilee or the Negev. You know, so the sort of social divides and how they're reflected in politics are very different.
For sure. And I definitely agree that that misconception on kind of the level of representation in the government is one that deserves mentioning. It's one that you touched on earlier with the concept of the Palestinians having their own control of their political systems. And that kind of separation, I believe, is also probably a pretty common misconception from the international community in terms of political participation. I'm going to go ahead with the last question.
Yeah, sorry, you just reminded me one more thing, that I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between Israeli Arabs and Palestinians, and they don't realize that, you know, about more than 20% of Israelis are Arabs, and they have full civil rights and full political rights.
Yes, and that's important to recognize because of the complexity of the democracy that's happening within the walls of Israel too. So this question, I actually don't know too much about, but I'm intrigued to learn more. It says there's been a lot of articles about American advisors helping with several of the Israeli campaigns. Has it really changed anything on the ground with campaigning?
I just kicked my tripod. Oops. Okay. So there have been articles about this. I have to say that there are articles about this every time there's an election. It's not really a new thing. And Netanyahu introduced it in '96 when he ran. He brought in a brilliant Republican pollster named Arthur Finkelstein, who has since passed away. But he ran a very, very smart campaign for Netanyahu, and Netanyahu continued to use his services for years after that. Avigdor Lieberman also used him after that. But in 1996, Netanyahu brought this concept of American pollsters. In 1999, Ehud Barak, who ran against Netanyahu and won, brought in Bill Clinton's pollsters, the most famous of whom is James Carville. He sometimes like comments on TV and stuff. You guys might have seen him because he's still like on cable news and stuff these days. But it's not so new. So in this election also, Netanyahu now has this pollster called Aaron Klein, who worked with a lot of Republican candidates in the U.S. Yesh Atid has consistently worked with Mark Melman, who's been a pollster for Democrats, and more recently he started the organization Democratic Majority for Israel, if you've heard of them. They're an interesting organization, and he's a nice guy. And the Lincoln Project, right, which were sort of Republicans who were anti-Trump. So some of the people involved there were working with New Hope and Gideon Sa'ar. So, and also it's just a phenomenon that always happens. And I don't feel like in this election, you feel some sort of special influence of them.
That's comforting to hear, honestly. I think that there's a lot of potential for intervention in that way, that reflection would potentially be, I don't know, we talk a lot about how American action is not, the responsibility is not to create and shape Israeli democracy, it's to lead Israelis to do it themselves. So definitely worthy of further conversation. We are reaching the around 1:56 Central Time. I know you're in Tel Aviv, so it's a little bit closer to bed. Do I hand it over to you, David? Is that how we're going to close this out? I'm not entirely sure.
Sure thing, Toby. Thanks so much. And thank you so much, Lahav, as well, for this amazing conversation. We had a lot of great questions from our student participants, from Facebook Live, from you, Toby, and a lot of amazing insight from Lahav. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today, Toby and Lahav, for their time today, and I hope everyone has a great rest of their Sunday and a good start to the week. Have a great day, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you.